All right, well, we actually do have quite a bit to cover today, and the first few minutes we'll just be running through some logistics and an overview of ARCA, so I want to go ahead and jump right in. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ARCA's learning session on wildfire resilience in California. This webinar is organized by the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCA, and my name is Julia Kim. I'm a Senior Project Manager at the Local Government Commission. I'll be serving as I'm serving as a coordinator for ARCA, and will be helping to moderate this webinar along with Grace Kaufman, who is a project manager also at the Local Government Commission. Just a quick overview of today's agenda. Again, we'll just run through some logistics really briefly. I'll touch on ARCA at a high level for those who are not familiar with us, and then on to the main topic, why you're all gathered here. We'll hear about the Governor's Forest Management Task Force, as well as state initiatives to build wildfire resilience. We're trying to reserve as much time as we can for Q&A and a panel discussion, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up with a few brief closing remarks. Before we get started, just wanted to cover some logistical items. Everyone has been muted except for our panelists, but we do encourage you to connect your audio either through your computer if you have that capability, or by calling in, just so you can use the hand raising feature to ask a question verbally during the Q&A portion, as we do hope to make that discussion as engaging as possible. You can also submit a question through the Zoom control panel at any point, and we'll go ahead and read those questions out loud during the Q&A portion, which will be facilitated by Grace. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the ARCA website, along with any PowerPoint presentations. We'll also share that out to all of the registrants as part of follow-up. So briefly, just wanted to highlight ARCA. We are a statewide network of regional collaboratives working to advance adaptation at the state level, while also moving the needle on adaptation locally and regionally. And through ARCA, adaptation practitioners come together to exchange knowledge, resources, and tools through quarterly meetings, direct connections, and through a variety of other channels. We also support the formation of new regional collaboratives and have supported a number of existing collaboratives during their formation process. And we're currently in the stages of exploring opportunities to form a collaborative in the inland Southern California region. And we continue to try to engage with stakeholders in the San Joaquin Valley to facilitate the formation of a collaborative there as well. And lastly, we also work to ensure regional considerations are reflected in state planning and funding guidelines, but also serving as a streamlined channel for state agencies to engage with local and regional stakeholders. And a lot of that is done through our partnership and our engagement with our state liaison, which is the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and we'll have Nuantara, who's going to be presenting later on. As you can see, our current membership of collaboratives: 7 regions: the North Coast, Sierra Nevada Mountains, the Capital Region, the Bay Area, Central Coast, LA County, and San Diego County. And again, we serve as the coordinator, and we also have a number of affiliate members who are part of our network. And if you're interested in learning more or joining this network, feel free to reach out. All right, now on to the topic at hand. First, I'd like to introduce our presenters. We'll first hear from Jennifer Montgomery. Jennifer Montgomery was appointed in April 2019 by Governor Gavin Newsom to Director of the Governor's Forest Management Task Force. In this role, Jennifer coordinates efforts with all levels of government and private stakeholders to design and execute strategies to better manage California's wildlands for public safety, natural resource protection, recreation, and sustainable economic development. Prior to accepting the governor's appointment, Jennifer served as the 5th District Supervisor on the Placer County Board of Supervisors since 2009, representing the area from Auburn to Lake Tahoe. And we'll then hear from Nuantara Key. Nuantara Key is a Climate Resilience Program Director with the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. She leads the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, also known as ICARP, which serves to better align adaptation efforts with an eye towards supporting local implementation. In this role, Nuantara chairs the ICARP Technical Advisory Council. And prior to joining OPR, Nuantara co-founded co-founded an international initiative on community-based climate action and has worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors on sustainable urban and regional planning and policy with a focus on social equity and climate change. Thank you both so much for being here. I know you're both so busy, so I think a lot of folks will appreciate hearing from you. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Julia. I appreciate the introduction. I would just mention that in addition to my experience as a county supervisor, I've spent the last 30 years living in the wildland-urban interface. And my husband is a fire captain in a local department up in Lake Tahoe. And so this intersection of forest health and fire is something that is near and dear to my heart on a variety of fronts. But today I'm really here to talk about the Forest Management Task Force and what it is we do, because we're a bit of a mystery, I think, to a lot of folks. The brief background is that the Forest Management Task Force was created in 2018 through an executive order of Governor Jerry Brown. It came out of the Tree Mortality Task Force, which arose in response to the drought and bark beetle crisis that we had starting really around 2012 and then lasting for 5 years, our drought here. As a result of that drought and the bark beetle, we have about 147 million trees in the Sierra Nevada at the last count that have died. We expect that number to continue to rise. But the good news is that we saw some slowing of that mortality in the last couple of years. And so we believe with the couple of fairly wet winters we've had that we can start to see some resilience in our forests. When we recognized that the tree mortality itself was slowing, we realized that there were larger issues facing our forests and frankly all our wildlands in California than just the drought and the bark beetle piece. There were basic issues of forest health, natural resources that have been depleted through various processes, both human and natural. And we recognized that we actually needed to do something that really approached forest management more holistically. And so in 2018, May of 2018, the Forest Management Task Force was created again out of the Tree Mortality Task Force. And since then, it really has functioned as the nexus or the hub with a lot of spokes radiating off it for conversations across all levels of government relating to forest health, fire, and a number of other issues. And now I'm going to put my reading glasses on so that I make sure I hit all the points that I really wanted to make on that. We were doing a lot of work around the forest management, and then of course we had the terrible Camp Fire last November in California. And out of that, it became very clear that in addition to this focus on forest health, natural resources, we really needed to think about how better to protect communities and make them not just fire resistant, but fire survivable. And so the Forest Management Task Force is, in addition to thinking about forest health, we're really looking at three things. We're looking at public safety, questions like how do people prepare for wildfire? How do we notify them? How do we harden homes and other human-built infrastructure, including roads, bridges, utility infrastructure? How do we make communities and infrastructure more fire survivable or fire safer? I am always quite cautious about saying that anything is fire safe because given the right situation and the right circumstances, nothing is guaranteed. So we have really a three-legged stool focusing on humans, so public safety. And then we have kind of the immediate, public safety, natural resources, and making sure that we don't just protect the natural resources that we have in our forests and wildlands now, but we actually start taking steps to enhance those and make them more resilient, both to continued human encroachment, but also very clearly to climate change. And then, of course, out of that, we recognize that there will be a lot of biomass material that will come out of the forest. And so we are trying to identify some sustainable economic development processes that will benefit both urban and rural communities, utilizing the biomass that would otherwise be open burned or even worse, consumed in an uncontrolled wildfire. I will say that 57% of the forested lands in California, the wildlands, are under the purview of the federal government, whether it's the U.S. Forest Service, the Park Service, Bureau of Reclamation, or any other federal agencies out there. The state of California has responsibility for the remainder of those lands, and those include private lands. They include about 3% state lands. They include timber operators. They include tribal lands, but we meaning CAL FIRE and the state, are the first responders to those incidents should we have a fire in our forests or in our wildlands. We also do a lot of the work in advance of fire to try to reduce fire and create more healthy forests. And in the last 2 years, the state of California has actually expended over 50% of our dollars and resources toward maintaining federal lands, because we recognize that those federal lands have an intersection with our own lands, and fire doesn't have boundaries that say, oh look, it's a federal land, we're not going to go there, or move from federal land to private lands. The Forest Management Task Force convenes monthly. We have a meeting that about 100 to 120 people attend. And we have a number of goals. We are tasked with implementing the governor's executive order B5218, and those of you who are B52 fans will laugh along with me. I always love that executive order number. We're also working to implement the Forest Carbon Plan. We are directed to help coordinate the state's investments in forest health. We are directed to expand and improve forest management to enhance forest health and resiliency. We are working on minimizing regulatory barriers. And when I say that, I don't mean we're going to throw CEQA out the window or do away with permitting, but we really are taking a long, hard look at the regulations that exist. Do they make sense? Are there ways that they could be streamlined, meaning made more quickly, that people could move through the process so that they can get out to vegetation management or other prescriptions on the forest and in the wildland? And we're looking, speaking of prescriptions, at trying to expand the use of prescribed fire. And there's a lot of impediments to that particular effort, including just 100 years plus of overgrowth in our forests and additional biomass that we can't just go in and do prescribed fire. We will need to go in and do either mechanical or hand removal of materials, and only then can we introduce prescribed fire. There's issues around prescribed fire with smoke management as well. So we are working very closely with California ARB, the air districts here in California and others to identify how can we better manage smoke, recognizing that there may be more of it in the interim as we return prescribed fire to our forests. And we're also working on public information and outreach, both to small-scale landowners, but also to other folks who, may not recognize that not every tree is a good tree and not every fire is a bad fire. And so we're starting to try to recalculate that conversation and educate people around what good forest management looks like. And that may not be the visual that we have seen always of forests in our lifetime, but it's how the resources within forests operate and what benefits they bring: water, air, recreation, timber resources. We are also incentivizing innovation in forest products. So we're trying to figure out, again, what do we do with the biomass coming out of our forests? Is it a cross-laminated timber process? Are we going to make pellets? Will it be bioenergy and biofuels? All of these things are conversations happening at the level of the Forest Management Task Force. I jokingly say to my husband sometimes that I am the grease in the machinery that allows all these different moving parts to work together. Some of those moving parts are federal partners, some I've mentioned already, many different state agencies. We're working very closely with counties, and I want to really try to reinforce that. 56 of the 58 counties in California have some forest. And I'm very much looking to adding and expanding tribal representation. We are really kind of lacking on that front, and the historical and cultural practices that our California tribes have could very much educate us and add to the toolbox that we've got to manage our ecosystems. We also have nonprofit groups that represent the environmental community. We have general members of the public. The California Fire Safe Council attends many resource conservation districts throughout California, and a number of the California conservancies, including the California Tahoe Conservancy and the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. But any and all are welcome to join us. So if you would like to join us at our monthly meetings, please do. We also do broadcast them on the web. As I said, we have one large meeting per month. It's co-chaired by Jessica Morse from the California Natural Resources Agency, Ashley Conrad Seda from Cal EPA, and Chief Tom Porter from CAL FIRE. We have 7 working groups, including prescribed fire, landowner education and outreach, science advisory team, regulations and permitting, wood utilization, forest management and restoration, and kind of a holdover from the original structure, our tree mortality working group. We've also set up 4 regional prioritization teams throughout the state: North, Central Coast, South, and what we are calling Sierra East, which covers, as you would expect, the Sierra both on the west side and the east side. And we have asked those folks to work together to help us identify projects and policies that would work within their regions, understanding that every region in California is somewhat different, and we are going to need to tailor approaches to the work we do. The scope of the Forest Management Task Force I call evolving. It was organized to protect environmental quality, public health, and economic benefits that forests in California provide, but it has moved, and it will probably continue to move beyond that original vision. We've had a number of folks who have come to us who have said, what are you doing about the insurance issues that are facing California and people who live in wildlands? And these are both insurance issues as to just homeowners insurance. Many people are getting non-renewed, or their insurance is, quadrupling in some instances. But it's also, can we create an insurance pool for small-scale, non-commercial landowners to reintroduce prescribed fire to their home, their properties and their communities, recognizing that there is always a chance with prescribed fire that it may escape. And so we need to figure out how to put together an insurance pool that can help protect those folks should they do all the right things and the fire still escapes and causes damage to a neighboring property owner. That was not something that was originally on the menu for the task force, but it's very clearly something that people are asking us to take a look at. We're also being asked to take a look at this issue of infrastructure hardening, home hardening. Again, not envisioned originally in the task force, but many folks have come to us and said, what do I do to make my home and my community safer beyond the 100 feet lean, mean, and green that CAL FIRE requires under the 4291 Public Safety Code? But what can we do in terms of redoing decks so that they are maybe not made out of wood? What can we do about replacing the screening on vents so that we don't get ember casts that get up in people's homes? What are some other things that can be done? And the question as always is, what are the resources for that? And at this point, unfortunately, my answer is always the resources for that have not been identified, but these are things that we should all be doing as private property owners to the full extent possible. So I'm going to kind of wrap up with 2 things. One is, what is the sort of future of the task force? Task forces and blue ribbon panels are really set up to take a look at a fairly specific issue normally, make a recommendation, and then say, great, we're done, we can all go home. Forests, wildlands in California are not a one and done proposal. We can certainly come up with recommendations for the governor and the legislature and try to get those implemented, try to get our federal partners and county partners to implement, but forests grow forever. People build homes in our wildlands, and so this is going to be a continuing and ongoing process that the state and the federal government particularly will need to take on. So I certainly envision some sort of scenario where we have a permanent entity within the state of California that is focused on natural and working landscapes and how they create benefits for us, whether it's agriculture or recreation or clean water or clean air. That is probably a recommendation I will be taking to the governor fairly soon, and really hoping that he will recognize that this issue of wildland management will require ongoing funding and staffing and should not be subject to the annual budget process that we go through at the state. And then I will absolutely close on that, and we'll take questions later by inviting everyone to our next meeting. It's August 12th at the Cal EPA building here in Sacramento in the Coastal Room, and I would welcome anyone to come to that. It's pretty interesting and enlightening. And again, if you can't make it, we do broadcast over the net. And I think I will wrap up with that. And thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. For folks on the line, hang on to those questions. We're going to try to, we'll save that for the panel discussion and the Q&A session, but please do keep those questions coming through the portal. And with that, we'll turn it over to you, Nuantara.
Great, thank you so much. So this is Nuantara Key. I'm in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and as was mentioned, I'm our Climate Resilience Program Director. So today, I'm going to provide a brief overview on the state's climate resilience framework, including a few of the components that we've been working on through OPR and our adaptation program. I'm also going to cover a few of the administration's key wildfire resilience efforts and accomplishments so far this year that really build on a lot of the work that Jennifer just described. I'm also going to, at the very end, include just a few quick highlights on some funding that has come through this year's budget that I just wanted to let people be aware of. So I think everybody knows that California has always experienced extremes, and we are a land of extremes. But California is exacerbating these kind of historic and what we've understood as our extreme climate in California. And the fourth assessment, California's fourth climate assessment that was released last year in 2018, really, I think, framed out some of the projections in California of what we can anticipate with a changing climate. And I've included a couple of the key statewide summary results from that assessment. The one here specific to wildfire is that one of the reports from the assessment really looked at the average area burns that we could anticipate in California, and that could, if emissions continue to rise, could increase by up to 77% by 2100. We also have seen that 15 of the 20 most destructive wildfires in the state's history have occurred since 2000, with 10 of the most destructive fires since 2015. Jennifer talked about the drought and the tree mortality issue, which is really also being driven by drought and temperature change as well. At the same time, currently 11 million, or nearly 25% of the state's population, lives in high-fired risk areas. And as we saw with the 2018 and 2019 fires, we saw, unfortunately, 139 fatalities in those across those two fire years. So as we are looking at the current conditions, both in terms of forest health and forest management, but also our land use and development and growth patterns, we really, across the administration, are really taking priority actions to balance both our natural resource management approach with our climate goals, and also thinking about our need to really think strategically and incorporate climate considerations into our long-range planning and growth patterns and development patterns. I also just want to include here, as part of a little bit of context setting, this is by no means a comprehensive list of all the different climate policies that are out there, but I just wanted to include a few here that are some of the key both executive orders and then legislation that has been passed over the last number of years, really highlighting the leadership that California, both the executive and legislative branches, have shown in terms of supporting the state's climate goals, and also over the years the work to both address emissions reduction and set very ambitious commitments to reducing emissions, but also our commitment to ensuring that we're building adaptation and resilience into an integrated approach on climate here in California. I also think it is great to see the alignment between, over the years, between the executive and a number of the executive orders that have also been taken up and advanced by the legislature. So one of the pieces of legislation that I'm going to talk about here is SB 246, just for a quick second and a little bit of context setting on some of the adaptation work we've been doing at OPR. So SB 246 created the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, or ICARP, that's our acronym, out of OPR. And our charge through that program, as was mentioned at the very big top of the webinar, is really to better align state and local efforts on adaptation and resilience, but really with an eye towards supporting local implementation. And when we launched our program in 2017, our council that advises the program really recognized that our adaptation and resilience work was about a decade behind where our climate mitigation work was, and that one of the very first things we needed to do was really chart a path and a vision for where we wanted to go and what a resilient California looks like. So on your screen, you can see a section of the vision statement. This is not all of the text in the vision statement. It's available on our website, and I'm happy to follow up with that link. But I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that as we are thinking about resilience, and this echoes and builds on what Jennifer was saying, I think, and aligns with the Tree Mortality Task Force, is that building resilience in California really requires looking at communities and recognizing that people in communities need to be able to respond to change, but we also need to build resilience and support resilient natural systems as well as our infrastructure and built systems, and that we really need to start moving towards a much more integrated approach around thinking about communities and whole communities rather than sectoring off and into our silos. So that's kind of a frame for how we approach our resilience work. One of the other key points that came from our work, especially in the first couple years of our program, was also an effort to define vulnerable communities. And I've pulled up the definition here and also included a link in the cover to a resource guide that we pulled out. But we also recognized early on that there wasn't a definition for what we meant by vulnerable communities, especially in an adaptation context. And so our council also adopted this definition. And again, I think one of the really important pieces to this work is recognizing the importance of understanding community capacity to deal with a changing climate, whether it's large immediate disasters or long-term kind of chronic changes associated with climate. And then I'm just going to give a very quick plug here. One of the other components of our adaptation program is the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which we built and maintain out of our office, which is really intended to serve a community of practice around the state of pulling together adaptation and resilience resources. So you can go check it out at resilientca.org. The URL is there at the top left. So now diving into, with that context, kind of diving into some of the key actions that have been taken under this administration to really take decisive action to implement recommendations and solutions to reduce wildfire risk and build resilience in California. The first on the left of your screen is the executive that came out of an executive order. It's the CAL FIRE's Community Wildfire Prevention and Mitigation Report, and the governor issued Executive Order N0519 during the first week in office. The main charge for this body of work was really to identify and prioritize near-term actions that the administration could take to reduce wildfire risk. And it includes identification of 35 priority fuel reduction projects that are taking place across the state. One of the things I want to highlight, and one of the recommendations that's really central to the work we've been doing at OPR, and I think is a great opportunity to bring in the long-term kind of community resilience piece into these near-term projects, is one of the recommendations, and it's number 10 in the report, that describes and recommends continued work to define and understand what drives community vulnerability in the context of wildfire. The CAL FIRE's report really, I think, establishes a great beginning and identification of some of the factors that drive vulnerability, but we are very excited to have one of the recommendations in here really calling for continued understanding of that, because I think there's lots that we still need to understand of the dynamics on the ground. The second report here that I mentioned is the Strike Force report. And in early January, the Governor's Strike Force was created to coordinate the state's efforts to provide for the safety, reliability, and affordability of energy, as well as to continue progress towards achieving the state's climate commitments. So the administration directed the Strike Force to develop a comprehensive strategy to address the impacts of catastrophic wildfires and climate change, and especially looking at the destabilizing effect on the energy sector. And the report was released in April of this year and made a series of recommendations around a few different objectives. One is reducing the frequency and severity of wildfires and strengthening emergency response. The second is mitigating climate change through clean energy policy. The third is providing fair and equitable allocation of wildfire costs and damages. And then the fourth is to make the necessary changes to stabilize utilities to meet energy needs. And I'll circle back to how some of these recommendations have fed into some recent legislation that was just passed and signed. But before I do that, I just want to highlight also the work of the Commission on Catastrophic Wildfire and Cost and Recovery, that was also led out of OPR. And the commission was established through SB 901, which was signed last year. And the commission, through a series of public meetings around the state and with very robust engagement and quite a large amount of stakeholder feedback, developed and released a report, a series of recommendations that were delivered to the governor and the legislature just this last month in June. And there are four key areas that those recommendations are around. The first is addressing utility liability. The second is creating an effective mechanism to assist in the payment of catastrophic wildfire costs. The third is around looking at stabilizing the insurance market, especially looking at affordable coverage for homeowners. Jennifer mentioned the importance of insurance in the wildfire context. And then also, lastly, reducing wildfire risk. So all of these efforts have also really informed the legislative process this year. And I just want to highlight that there was a package of bills that were just signed by the governor that really work to stabilize the energy sector in context of wildfire, but also really looking at ensuring that there are funds to support wildfire victims, while also really enhancing the oversight of utility safety measures. I'm happy to dive into or answer questions on that legislation during the Q&A if there are any. I want to just, last point before I wrap up here, is also highlight a few of the funding options that are coming through this recently signed this year's budget, the 1920 budget. And these are just a few examples. I think that overall the budget obviously was very focused on these issues, so there's a lot in there. But I did want to highlight, especially recognizing that we may have a number of local governments on the line, that the budget includes $75 million in one-time general fund to work with local governments around the response to utility-led public safety power shutdowns, and that there are planning grants that are going to be available to improve local preparedness for the power shutdowns to county offices of emergency management, and that will be coming through Cal OES. I also want to highlight that the forest health and fire prevention funding that is available, there are $225.8 million available through CAL FIRE and $200 million allocated annually for 5 years, really to support forest management and fuel reduction, including through CAL FIRE's forest health grants. And then lastly here, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities programs through Strategic Growth Council also received significant funding to continue investing in affordable housing. And SGC is really taking, I think, a leading role and example in how they're thinking about incorporating climate resilience into the housing investments, especially affordable housing investments that the state is making. So a couple key takeaways I'll wrap up here are that, for the administration, it really is a priority that we balance and better integrate our climate resilience and emissions goals with our growth and housing demands, and that really climate adaptation and resiliency really we're seeing that as being integral to our approach to thinking about long-term planning and growth and development, and really integrating climate throughout our policies and work on that. And for our office specifically, we continue to, as I mentioned, both in terms of our definition for vulnerable communities and the example I gave from the 45-day report, we are very committed and interested in continuing efforts to align and better advance our understanding of climate vulnerability, especially in an adaptation context. So we'll continue working on that over the course of this next year. And I did want to highlight that we are going to be updating our fire hazard planning technical advisory series. It's quite a mouthful of a title, but we are going to be updating that per direction in SB 901 as well, and we'll be releasing an update to that next summer. I just wanted to highlight here on this slide, there's also a hyperlink to the current version in case that's of use or is of interest to the listeners on the webinar. So with that, I want to thank LGC again for the invitation, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nu and Tara. As I think Grace is going to go ahead and start this video so y'all can see Nu and Tara and Jennifer again during the panel discussion. Wanted to first, looks like we have some questions coming in, but wanted to first see if anyone wants to ask a question verbally. Please feel free to use that hand raising feature in the Zoom platform, and we can go ahead and unmute you. While we wait for that, Grace, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to ask away or to facilitate the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And thank you to Nu and Tara and Jennifer for joining us today. The first question that we have, folks really appreciate the efforts on behalf of vulnerable and disadvantaged communities generally. What efforts are being made to prioritize wildfire resilience for socially and economically disadvantaged communities? And any thoughts on insurance for those communities specifically?
Well, I think we each could probably answer that from a different perspective. I will say, as a former county supervisor from a rural community, the definition of disadvantaged communities has always been a little bit problematic when we look at areas in the wildlands and in our forested communities specifically. But there are some efforts to really better hone in on what it means to be a disadvantaged community in our wildlands. And in terms of insurance, the efforts that we are really making around insurance, and I'm sure Nu and Tara has something to add to this, really are focusing on how can we allow homeowners, property owners in the wildlands to do the appropriate work to keep their homeowners insurance at a rate that is affordable. The situation we have right now is many insurance companies, understandably, are pulling back on insuring folks in the wildlands. I want to make sure that homeowners, property owners can keep their insurance, and that the insurance companies can make a good return on investment. I'm, a capitalist, and I believe that we can achieve both of those things. We do have a program at the state, the FAIR Plan, which is often referred to as the insurance of last resort. So if a homeowner is unable to get insurance through the primary market or even through the secondary market, they can obtain insurance through the FAIR Plan. Now, the FAIR Plan really only covers fire, so that requires homeowners to pull a second policy that would cover the other things that you would normally consider with a homeowner's policy. It's problematic. I am honestly hearing from a number of folks that they're just choosing not to get insurance at all because they can't afford it. And obviously that is not a good choice for any of us, but it has some significant implications for counties. If your home is not insured, you can't sell it, which means it's probably worth less, which means downward valuation, which means less property tax revenue for counties, which then probably means fewer services, which then means things are worth less, and it becomes this vicious circle. So we are really trying to work with the Department of Insurance to understand how we can offer a better suite of insurance opportunities to folks, and I will turn that over to you and Tara.
Great. I would just add, in terms of the first portion of the question around prioritizing, understanding and prioritizing actions for vulnerable communities, I would echo Jennifer mentioned in terms of, recognizing that some of the existing definitions that we have around identifying disadvantaged communities, which, were really designed with a very specific and very important purpose, that as we're moving into kind of a understanding of climate impacts and what those mean to our communities, I think we also need to be thinking about how we understand and define vulnerable communities. And that's where to really incorporate additional understanding that maybe isn't captured in some of our existing definitions. I think especially, as Jennifer mentioned, in rural and especially also with tribal communities, there are a number of things that really just don't show up in how we've been thinking about disadvantaged communities that are really important in an adaptation context. And I'm definitely not saying that, one is better or, we need to change our definition on disadvantaged communities. I think it's really about adding in additional layers and understanding of how climate exacerbates other socioeconomic and some of the built infrastructure conditions that communities are living in. So I think, our definition of vulnerable communities was really trying to get at that and understand where there is overlap between disadvantaged communities and our understanding on vulnerability. But I would say there's still a lot of work to do to really flesh that out and understand what vulnerability means relative to different climate impacts as well. Because what makes you potentially be at more risk to climate may be different than what poses a greater risk for extreme heat or drought or flooding. So we really need to understand that. One of the other ways, really quickly, that we've been focusing on this is also looking at the requirements that local governments need to meet per SB 379, which requires locals to incorporate climate into their general plan and specifically in the safety element. So we've really been looking at how do we, through the work that we and the role that we play in releasing the general plan guidelines, make sure that local governments have the resources and tools to understand community and social vulnerability as they're going through their general plan update process to incorporate climate. So yeah, that and I'll turn it back over for additional questions.
Thank you. And kind of building off, I think, Jennifer, this one is more for you. You had referenced the FAIR Plan. And so is the state considering a plan or a mandate that's similar for property owners who do maintain their land correctly, but are getting denied insurance? Is the state looking into another mandate, or is it just under the FAIR Plan?
So as far as I know, the state is not looking for a particular mandate at this point. The state is really interested in engaging with the insurance companies and the insurance community to say, here are the risks,
here are the mitigations that people are putting in place. How do we actually create a calculation out of that that looks at the risks and looks at the mitigations and says this is your actual cumulative risk based upon those things, and therefore what should you be paying? Right now, insurance companies generally just look at the risk side of the equation. They don't actually say, what are the mitigations? And for some reason, homeowners insurance is really kind of the only insurance where that happens. I mean, if you are a safe driver and you've taken a safe driving class, or you're, a member of AARP, as I am, and you've taken one of their driving classes, your insurance company looks at that and factors it into your risk as someone being insured. Same thing with medical. How tall are you? How much do you weigh? Do you smoke? Do you drink? So insurance companies, for some reason, balance those risks and the offsets in those other insurance situations. But so far, it's been more problematic around homeowners insurance. So I certainly am going to be pushing with whatever authority I have, that we have those conversations and we really work with the insurers to say, hey, this person has done everything right. They've passed their 4291 inspection. Their local fire department's given them a thumbs up. They've replaced their wooden deck with something else. They've got a metal roof. They've got double pane windows with fireproof shutters. They've fixed their vents. They've boxed their eaves. They need some insurance at a reasonable rate that reflects both their risk and the mitigations that they've taken. So not sure that specifically answers the question, but I hope it gets to it at least in parts.
Okay. And I would just add on that similarly from our perspective too at OPR, thinking about kind of the community scale interventions and mitigation efforts, and as I mentioned, local governments are starting to incorporate climate into their general plan. We're also really interested in figuring out, are there community scale interventions and mitigation efforts that could similarly provide benefit to individual homeowners? But the question is, how do you get those integrated into that risk modeling? So in addition to individual kind of parcel-based or home-by-home mitigation efforts, we're also really interested in exploring the community scale or public mitigation efforts that can provide benefit as well.
Absolutely, and that's where we get to, the approach around the WUI, which is the immediate area in and around communities, but dealing really with vegetation rather than structures.
Great, thank you. And so as you both know, land use continues to be a significant barrier, not just to meet our resiliency goals, but also to meet mobility targets to reduce BMTs and more. Do you have any case studies, resources, advice on how local jurisdictions can make progress on this front?
Okay, well, I'll dive into that one as a former county supervisor. I have been mystified, I will say, in the 10 years that I was a county supervisor at some of the land use planning decisions we made. I'm a staunch advocate for private property rights, and I believe that if you buy a piece of property and it is zoned in a particular way and it comes with a certain set of uses, within most situations, you should be able to utilize that. Where I was often at odds with my fellow supervisors was around conversion of lands, for example, forest lands or timber production zones, and allowing them to become something else with a higher, more intensive use. I think counties, particularly since they have that ultimate land use authority, really need to consider the risks that they are putting not just on the individual or the individuals moving into those areas, but frankly, the economic risks they're putting on themselves as counties. To supply services to those communities is generally not something that actually pencils out over the long term. There may be a short-term economic return to the counties in terms of property tax, but I think counties really need to consider what does it actually cost to provide services to those communities, whether it's roads, water, sewer, sheriff's departments, fire response. I think stopping the conversion of properties from one use to another is something that would have really significant impacts on reducing the growing problem with wildfire and wildfire response in our forests particularly.
Great, thank you. And so for both of you, what are some top strategies for building community resiliency? So coming down a little bit from the scale of the states, more thinking like community level to neighborhood level? Do you guys have any strategies?
Well, I think there's some wonderful examples out there and some incredible partners who can be so deeply involved on this on a local community scale. I think the resource conservation districts are a really underutilized opportunity for folks in all rural communities. Fire safe councils, local fire safe councils have just an incredible work ethic. They're absolutely visionary about how they approach both vegetation management, but also infrastructure hardening, how they educate people, how they prepare people. They do great work around identifying for communities things like, okay, here is a potential escape route, but in the case of a particular emergency, that may not be your escape route. So here's where you go for additional information on the day. They're helpful around things like identifying temporary refuge areas within communities. In Paradise, they used, I believe it was the parking lot for Target. Wasn't particularly identified as a temporary refuge area to most people in the community. They weren't aware of it, but those places exist in communities. And so building capacity really has to happen from the ground up. The state can be helpful, the feds can be helpful by bringing resources and information and advice, but it's got to be driven at the local level because people understand their communities, they understand the specific threats, and they understand the real opportunities available. And only by engaging counties, water districts, fire districts, park districts, and the other folks, who are really involved at that very local level, are we going to be successful in building resiliency into these communities.
And to build on that, I would also highlight the importance also of investing in building capacity in community-based organizations as well as our local public agencies. And I think there are a number of examples where during the fires of the last few years where community-based organizations have really stepped in and played a really critical and important and life-saving role for especially working with like linguistically isolated communities or culturally specific communities that aren't reached through kind of more traditional public notification systems, and also some of the health and safety needs of different communities. And so I would also highlight just the really critical role that funding and investing in community-based organizations to be part of that really locally driven landscape is also really critical.
Agreed.
Thank you both. So another question, thinking about Cal OES's methodology for evaluating and mapping vulnerable communities. What do you both think about that? Very open-ended.
So I have to say that I am not particularly familiar with it, and I would not feel comfortable opining on it, but having heard the question, I will now go look into it and learn more about it. I don't want to talk rubbish when I absolutely don't need to.
Great.
Yeah, I would say I'd say the same.
Great question, though.
Thank you. All righty. And thinking about the mitigation versus risk conversation that we were having earlier, and that the state is having with insurance companies right now, how can we assist homeowners with lower and fixed incomes to obtain funding to mitigate these risks in and around their homes?
Wow, so that's a great question. I would say the funding is really the tough part. Assemblyman Wood had a piece of legislation, I'm sorry, I don't remember the number, maybe you do, and Tara, that he was proposing, I think it was $1 billion that would go to communities who were at risk, and particularly identifying folks who maybe had mobility issues or, were unable for a number of reasons to do the work. Right now, the biggest problem that we have in this conversation is identifying the dollars for it. One of the suggestions that was made to me recently is Boy Scouts doing their Eagle Scout projects. These are actually the kind of projects that would be perfect for Eagle Scouts to assist people who might be elderly or disabled in doing some of the more simple things that you can do, moving wood piles away from homes, removing vegetation from around the structure of your home, replacing the vents with finer mesh screening, and even I would say up to and including things like boxing in eaves. I think probably re-roofing might be beyond the scope of an Eagle Scout and other community groups. I mean, a lot of the veterans organizations that I worked with as a county supervisor went out and did these kinds of projects for people in their communities. So I think there is capacity
within communities to start doing this work while we, or at least I, continue to try to work with the state and our federal partners to identify dollars to actually make this happen for people. It's not cheap. There are no cheap fixes, but there are some that are less expensive than others.
Great, thank you. And so another question, is the Commission on Catastrophic Wildfire Costing Recovery working with the Forest Management Task Force, or did that commission disband after the report was released? Is there any overlap in that commission with the commission that you're managing?
So they were really focusing, I would say, largely on the issue around utilities. And the Forest Management Task Force, we certainly have envisioned that and had some discussions around it, but that was not our primary focus. And so there was certainly overlap between the two. You know, I read the report when it came out. There were certainly things that were germane to the Forest Management Task Force, but we haven't particularly worked, you know, closely on these things. Did you have a different perspective?
I would agree. And I would say that the commission delivered, when it delivered its report to the governor and the legislature, the body of that work, of that commission wrapped up. So moving forward.
Yeah, and I just, for folks who, I mean, I think Julia referenced it in the introduction, that I've been in this position for 3.5 months. So sometimes there are things that have occurred before I came on board that I'm not entirely familiar with, but my understanding is they were working in parallel, but not so much hand in hand.
Great, thanks. And so stories from community members directly impacted by the 2018-2019 fires continue to emerge. And while these stories represent different experience, there's a common thread around trauma. How do we help our communities build mental and psychosocial resilience before and after the fires?
Oh, wow, what a great question. To be honest, that has not been part of the discussion in the Forest Management Task Force. Really sort of not set up under our guiding principles to have that conversation, but absolutely a conversation that needs to be had. Coming from Placer County, we had a very robust Health and Human Services division that really did focus on mental health and mental health issues. And the trauma that we do see coming out of those experiences last year are really quite overwhelming for people and potentially scarring for life in many cases. I don't have an answer from the state perspective, but I would just encourage folks to absolutely reach out to your local county and see what services they have that they can provide, because they're critical for healing.
Yeah, definitely. I would, one of the things that we've been working on is, and one of our roles at OPR is serving as the lead agency for this is a bunch of acronyms here, but there's community planning and capacity building through the recovery support function. And the recovery effort is really led by Cal OES, but we are a partner in this statewide recovery process. And I would say that is something that is definitely coming up in those conversations as we're thinking about what is the state strategy and how does the state support local recovery after disasters, and recognizing really the importance of focusing on the social and mental health needs of communities that have gone through or continue to go through the trauma of an event, months, years afterward, and that really affects community capacity, but also that kind of sense of community cohesion that I think is really important to building resilience. So I don't have a specific answer maybe, but it's definitely something that is very front and center in our conversations in the recovery space, and trying to figure out how we get the right resources to the people who need it.
And I would say in advance of something like a wildfire or a landslide or a flood, there are a lot of things that people can do within their own communities. I look at some programs, around CERT, which is a Community Emergency Response Team. A lot of those folks are working with isolated people within their communities ahead of an emergency to say, how do we prepare? How do we prepare to make sure you have all the stuff you need to move out of your home when and if the time comes? How do we prepare to move you? Having those conversations ahead of time, having a plan, having that ready, set, go plan that CAL FIRE is suggesting that we all have in place, I think will help
reduce future trauma. Because I think if you plan for something and you are prepared for it, and you have the ability, which is not always the case, so I'm not finger pointing at people, if you have the ability to evacuate as soon as possible in, you know, the most painless way possible, which again is not always possible, I think that will really help reduce future trauma for people. And a recognition that, as Nuantara pointed out, California is a land of, you know, catastrophe. If it's, you know, Rosanna used to say, if it's not one thing, it's another. And, you know, that's kind of the situation in California. It's a flood, it's a fire, it's a landslide, it's an avalanche. You know, it's an earthquake. Can't forget the earthquake. It's a tsunami if you live on the North Coast, or, you know, possibly even in Tahoe. So I think recognizing what faces us as Californians and planning for that will really help address those future concerns.
Great. Thank you for that. And Julia, I think we'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Grace. And a huge thanks to you both, Jennifer and Nuantara. This has been incredibly informative. And to all of our participants, thank you for joining us. And hopefully you also found it worthwhile and valuable. As a reminder, the webinar recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be shared via email. We'll aim to get that to folks by the end of the week. So tomorrow, we'll also post it on the ARCA website. And if you have any additional questions, it looks like there might have been a few questions through the Q&A portal that we weren't able to get to. Feel free to reach out to me and respond to my follow-up email, and we'll see if we can try to pull together written responses that we can share back out with the group. And finally, we hope that you can join us for our next learning session on July 23rd. You can find more info on our website. This will be looking at scanning the adaptation field, past, present, and emerging needs. And yeah, with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap. I know we're a minute behind, so we'll let you all go. And thank you so much again, Nuantara and Jennifer.
Thanks, Julia.